human title. It signifies, the term Son of God literally signifies that Jesus is God manifested in the flesh. But that title of Son always has reference to the incarnation. It refers to the whole person who Jesus is, God manifested in the flesh. But it's given in the context of time and humanity and incarnation. Now, in John 3:16, only begotten Son, many Greek scholars will say, well, the focus is not on the act of begetting, but unique, one of a kind. And that's fine. But the point is, if you're going to put a time to it, begetting is a point in time. It relates to the incarnation. Now, in Trinitarian theology.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there for a second, and we're going to kind of debunk the main premise that he's operating under here, which is he's trying to say that every time you hear the word begetting in Scripture, it's referring to a point in time. And so therefore, the Son is not eternally begotten, which is what the doctrine of the Trinity and what the Bible actually teaches, that the Son is being eternally begotten by the Father before all ages. There was never a beginning to his generation or begetting. He is always being begotten since the beginning and forever. Right? This is not something that God the Father chooses to do. It's something that he does of necessity. This is who God is. God is a Father who begets his Son, who from them two, they spirate, or the Spirit proceeds from them both. This all happens from all eternity. This is who God is. But what he did here is he kind of debunked himself inadvertently, because he himself mentioned that there are multiple fulfillments of that same scripture, this day have I begotten thee. So, for example, this is Psalm 2:7, the ancient prophecy, says, I will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Now, the first thing I'm going to point out is that God's day is in eternity. God is not constrained by time. He does not live in time. And so when he says something is occurring today, it's occurring always. Today would be the only way you would expect somebody who lives in eternity to speak, because they only live in the present. And so God only lives in the present. So he speaks, it's this day. He only lives in the present. He's eternal. And here's the other thing. Well, let's get first to the scripture. So this scripture is said to have been fulfilled in two different points of time, at the very least, that we have in Scripture. We have in Hebrews chapter 1, it mentions, for unto which of the angels said he at any time, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, so referencing Psalm chapter 2. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he saith, and let all the angels of God worship him. So this is referring to Christ's birth in Bethlehem. So one fulfillment of this day have I begotten thee is his birth in Bethlehem. That is true. But we see another fulfillment, and David K. Bernard also mentioned this one, is the resurrection. So in Acts 13:32, it says, the Apostle Paul speaking to the Jews in the synagogue, and we declare unto you glad tidings, how that the promise which was made unto the fathers, God hath fulfilled the same unto us their children, and that he hath raised up Jesus again, as it is also written in the second Psalm, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. So in Scripture itself, we see multiple fulfillments of Jesus Christ being begotten of the Father. It's not constrained to one point in time. And just think with me logically here. We already have this notion of a perpetuity to his being begetting, because it happened in his birth in Bethlehem, and it happened also at the resurrection. So just logically, if the eternal generation of the Son is true, as we believe it to be according to Scripture, wouldn't it be true to say, this day have I begotten thee every single day? It's true yesterday. It's also true tomorrow. It will be true the next day after that. It will be true 10 days from now, right? If the Son of God is being eternally begotten by the Father, then it's true every single day that you mention it. Okay, so this notion of multiple fulfillments in Scripture of his being begotten is completely consistent with the eternal generation of the Son. And here's the thing. How do we go from here to defend the fact that this generation goes on from eternity? Okay, we've established that it happens multiple times. It happens with some perpetuity. But we also see that the Son of God predates his birth in Bethlehem. I mean, we go to John chapter 1, and this is one that modalists love to quote, but I don't know why, because it just kind of debunks their whole false doctrine. So we have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we have this idea of the Word being both with God, and he was God. So clearly a distinction between the Word and God there, and that's referring to the Son and the Father. It says the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. By who? By the Word. And without him was not anything made that was made. And we find out down here in verse 14 who this Word is. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So it's the Son of God. The Son of God is the Word. So you can read this as, in the beginning was the Son, and the Son was with God, and the Son was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, the Son. And without him was not anything made that was made. So right here, and by the way they would explain this is the Word is just referring to the plan of the Father. He had the Son in his mind. The problem with that interpretation is you make God an abstraction. You make God an idea. Why? Because it says, and the Word was God. So you interpret the Word to mean some divine plan in the mind of the Father. You now have to say that God is a plan. God is no longer a personal being. He is a plan. And obviously that's heretical. So there's no way to interpret that with a oneness framework. We also see the Son existing. Once again, I'm going to give a couple of examples real quickly and then get into my point. We see the Son existing prior to the creation. Here again in Colossians chapter 1, where it says in verse 13, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness and hath translated us into the kingdom of his Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. The firstborn of every creature because he is before every creature, because he created every creature. Verse 16 specifies this, for by him, who, the Son, were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. So the Son created all things that were even in heaven. So he predates the creation of heaven, the creation of earth. He created it himself, actually. Okay? So we even see it in Hebrews chapter 1. I wasn't planning on seeing this, on reading this, but since I have it here up already, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. The Father made the worlds through the Son. So the Son made the world. The Son made, he was the creator. Okay, so clearly he predates his birth in Bethlehem. But oneness people would say, well, no, that's really all talking about the plan. That through this plan, this divine plan that the Father had, he had that plan in mind when he was creating the world. Okay, that's a ridiculous explanation. But there's no way to fit that explanation into this. This is, I believe, the kill shot. Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7 speaks of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, as we'll see, is a type of Christ. He is a symbol of Christ. Now, whether or not he's truly Christ, there's debate about this amongst Christians, whether or not he was literally a pre-incarnate form of Christ, or whether he is just a type of Christ, and so he's only Christ in the sense of a type. Doesn't matter. The point is, he is Christ for the purposes of this explanation here. So, Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 3 says, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. So we see the way that scripture alludes to him being Christ. It says he was the priest of the Most High God. Jesus Christ is our high priest. He is the king of righteousness. Jesus Christ is the righteous one, the one who imputes his righteousness to us. He is the king of peace. He is the prince of peace, as stated in Isaiah. And so we go further to verse number 3, speaking about, well, let's just read it. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. So what is it saying here? Pay attention. It's saying that there is a sense in which the Son of God has no earthly father, no earthly mother, has no descent, has neither beginning of days nor end of life. There is a sense in which that is true of the Son of God. But if your view of the Son of God is merely that he is a mode or manifestation that came to be at the incarnation, this is not true. The Son of God did not exist prior to that, because his whole existence is predicated on the fact that he has a mother, and that he had descent, and that he had beginning of days and an end of life at the crucifixion, although we know he resurrected, but there came a point where his life did end, at least temporarily. The modalist, you cannot interpret this passage from a modalist framework, because there is no context from a modalist framework in which the Son of God had no earthly mother and had no descent and had no beginning of days nor end of life. But that is the definition of the Son in the modalist framework, is that he had a mother and that he had descent and that he had beginning of days, so on and so forth. So what is this? What is Scripture actually telling us here? This is referring to the divine nature of the Son. The Son that eternally pre-existed as the eternally begotten Son of the Father. He had no earthly father. He had no earthly mother. He had no descent. He had neither beginning of days, because he's eternally begotten, nor end of life. He will always be begotten. So this is speaking to the divine nature of Christ. This thoroughly debunks any notion that the Son of God only came to be at the incarnation in Bethlehem's manger. We see that the Son of God, not only was he present in creation, he was the creator. And not only that, but we see here that he has no earthly father in a sense, no earthly mother, so on and so forth. He is the eternally pre-existent, eternally begotten Son of God. And so to be extremely clear, lest anyone not follow what I'm saying here, he's mentioned as being the Son of God before creation. So what made him the Son of God back then? Well, the same thing that has always made him a Son of God. The fact that he is begotten of the Father. That is why we say that he is eternally begotten. Because if he's begotten in Psalm 2:7, and he's begotten in Hebrews 1:5, and he's begotten in Acts 13:32, he's begotten multiple times, and that's why he's the Son, then what makes him the Son before all ages? Well, the same thing that always made him a son. He is begotten, but he is eternally begotten of the Father. That is the doctrine of the eternal generation of the Son. And if you want to know more about that, I go more in depth on this doctrine in episode 15 of the podcast. Just look through the timestamps there, where I think one is called the eternal generation of the Son.